I will moderate this panel. I will not speak. From my left to right, we have Constance Delioz, who is the Executive Director of McCourt Institute, which will soon become Project Liberty Institute. So for those of you who are confused that sometimes we call it McCourt Institute and Project Liberty Institute, it's in transition like everything on the digital space. Then next to Constance, we have Paul Nemitz, who is a principal advisor on the digital transition in Directorate General Justice and Consumers in the European Commission. On my right, I have Beatriz Botero, who is an assistant professor at the law school at Sciences Po, an affiliated Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. And then on the far right, in a geographical sense, not in a political sense, we have Matthew Gangsko, professor of economics at Stanford University, our keynote speaker and winner of Clark Medal recently. So we have about an hour, a bit more than an hour before the cocktail. So we'll try to be reasonably short in our introductory remarks. So we will talk about political implications, political, economic, and social implications of recent technological changes, digital transition. And basically, as you've seen from our afternoon sessions, we talk about social media and AI. And Nate has helpfully explained to us that AI may be a challenge to democracy, and it's a different challenge than social media. And so this is what we are going to start with. We will start with AI and probably talk later about social media. And since Paul has written a book on AI and democracy recently, even before ChatGPT became a sensation, I will ask Paul to talk about his views on the potential impacts of development of AI on democracy, and as well as somebody who works within the Commission, also tell us about the future of regulation and the potential Brussels effect of regulation of social media and AI. Paul, we agreed on 5 to 10 minutes of introductory remarks. These are very simple questions.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. First of all, congratulations to this program. I very much believe in watching the US. That's where these technologies are developed right now. That's where also the abuse is biggest. So academia and journalists in the US are closer to the technology. They are closer to the abuse because it's more radical. And also, let's say, the environment of the press, newsletters, and also competition in academia, I think brings up a lot of interesting reporting, and I think we can learn a lot. And I was very thankful for your presentation just before. It's always refreshing to hear voices which are so close to the fire. I don't want to advertise too much of my book, only say that it will come out in English now. It was in German 3 years ago. It comes out in English now in July or August. The title is The Human Imperative: Power, Democracy, and Freedom in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, which the book basically summarizes my experience as a political civil servant. I'm, a director in the Commission, which means I'm a political office holder. I was the lead director on GDPR. I was the Snowden. Yeah, okay. I was the lead director on GDPR. I was so basically 6 years of my life I spent bringing this instrument forward, first the legal draft, then also orchestrating the negotiations in Parliament and Council. Also the Snowden investigator for the Commission at the time was Bob Litt in the White House, became a good friend and teacher of US national security law. So all of this went into this book, which I haven't written alone, but with a philosopher and journalist. But what I would like to say is this. I think, first of all, democracy cannot degenerate into a repair shop of technology, just put out there, or business models which come from big tech. So while I appreciate the starting point of tech analysis, all the empirics and, how this messenger works and that AI and this company and that, this is all important. But the democratic ambition is not just that. It's not just risk-based regulation and repairing what they have failed with and what they have presented us, the problems. The ambition is a different one. The ambition is that we shape our lives. And as a starting point, therefore, I come from a different direction. I don't think it is good to always start only this thinking from this, let's say, empirical side and, you know, what the companies are doing. We have to maintain, first of all, the ambition to have a vibrant democracy in which the people decide and in which we shape the way we want to live. And that leads to many conclusions. One of the most dramatic conclusions is that, and I like the term you introduced here, the democratic sclerosis in the US, that the whole world is suffering from the inability of American democracy to come up with rules which frame the technological progress. And this has many reasons. You know, I could now give you a long lecture about the ideology of, you know, the California ideology, too much belief in technology, solving all the problems of the world, you know, underinvestment in democracy, Lawrence Lessig, you know, the money in American politics, and. But we can also just jump forward and say, we Europeans don't have to walk our head down because we make the democratic rules for technology while America is not able to do it. Much of the pain in the world for democracy and in the transatlantic relationship would not exist if America would match the technology with good democratic rules. And so my main message is that I think we can be proud that we are leading a renaissance of the law after a time of complete neoliberal under-regulation, you know, a wishy-washy ethics discourse into which much money flew from big tech, which had the purpose for some goodwilling also in America to replace the inability of Congress with at least some self-made rules. I would call them, you know, the good Americans, but of course, which for others had the purpose to avoid regulation, to be always able to say, well, we don't need binding laws, we're all doing it already ourselves. So I think, you know, we have fallen for this a little bit in Europe, as so often we fall for American things, but, you know, I think we have moved on. I've been myself a member of the Data Ethics Commission of the German government. I have followed very closely the AI high-level group at the Commission. You know, all of this was, of course, political decisions, which I personally don't necessarily share. But I am very happy that now we have moved on from the wishy-washy of ethics to the law. And let's remember, the law is the most noble act of a democracy for speaking. The democracy speaks through the law. And so, of course, we will now have compromise negotiations, you know, very complex. In GDPR, it was the same in many legal projects which I have led. You know, we had thousands of amendments, again, also in the AI Act, nearly 4,000 amendments. Well, you know, that is, of course, a lot of lobbying paper, but it is also witness to vibrant democracy. Of course, the results from a scientific point of view will be unsatisfying. They will be also unsatisfying from the point of view of technology and business models. Our rule of thumb in Brussels is if everybody protests, we are just right in the middle. And so what I would say is, the key point here is that through making law, we maintain and reinforce and recall the primacy of democracy over technology and business models. I think we have a majority in Europe and probably also in the United States of people who don't want to be ruled by big tech, whether it's the technological systems or big money. People don't want to be snooped on by the state, but they also don't want to be snooped on by the stalker economy, as Al Gore called it, neither in the US nor in Europe. And I think we have to progress with these projects, whether it's GDPR, whether it's, you know, copyright, net neutrality, whether it's the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, DMA, and so on. You have had the list already on the screen here, with great self-confidence. And I think we have to become more rigorous also in questioning very basic concepts which are put onto us from the engineering world and the neoliberal ideology. I would like to give you some basic thoughts for the next mandate of the Commission. We are now developing, as always at the end of the mandate, the package of ideas for the next Commission. Of course, the political choices are then made by the commissioners. But one issue we're talking about is, for example, can we actually live free in a world? Can a democracy function if we have these profiles of people all over the place? As you said, the very detailed profiles, which are pre-AI and which will be used much more effectively by AI to manipulate people and to manipulate whole systems of democracy. My answer to this question is no. We cannot be free with these profiles out there. If corporations and the state know more about us than we know ourselves, because we don't remember all the things which we did in the past, if all of them have these profiles about us, that is the end of freedom. So let us recall the basic jurisprudence, which says means of communication by principle must be free from surveillance. And I would say free from surveillance by private parties and public parties. So I would say it is a serious question in the next mandate of the Commission to simply do an interdiction of personal profiles. That's one of the issues I think we need to talk about. There are many other issues, but I would certainly say AI combined with these personal profiles is the door opener for a total technological manipulation of both individuals and societies as a whole. And that is a huge threat to freedom. And there I don't share the view that this tool will be equally helping the friends and the foes. I think what we have seen so far, at least, is that in the technologization of politics, those who are not the friends of democracy have always been in front. And I would say that is my thesis. It will not be different with AI. It will only be worse. And the personal profiles with or without AI are a huge threat to freedom, to self-determination. And combined with the tools of AI, and now we could expand, in many directions and how they undermine also other elements of law. This is of such a magnitude that I also don't need a lot of evidence to close down these profiles. Let me end with this maybe, because we had today a lot of empirical work. I love empirics, but we must allow ourselves in a fast-moving world to use the unique ability of humans to imagine and to think forward and make politics, often without empirics and evidence. This is what the precautionary principle of Hans Jonas is about, and what is a principle of primary law in the European Union. It's one of the few philosophers who has made it with his philosophical concepts into primary law. The precautionary principle obliges us to imagine possible terrible consequences of technology and to take the decisions which are necessary today to avoid these terrible consequences, even if we're not sure about them, even if we have no empirical evidence about them. To take the decisions today which are necessary to, with high certainty, avoid these impacts. And I think this is also important, because boy, have I had to have useless discussions with big tech about evidence. Evidence and asking for evidence is one of the key arguments of big tech when, for example, we say we have a 300 and 400% increase of violence, of political violence in Europe, and it has to do something with the internet. No, it doesn't have to do something with the internet. Show us the evidence. Honestly, having the history of fascism behind us, I don't need detailed evidence with formulas and so on to be able to say it has to do something with the communication environment. So we must allow ourselves, when dealing with AI and with these hugely powerful technologies, we must allow ourselves to use the unique ability of humans to imagine impacts consequences also in the long term and act on these imaginations and these potentialities without having the formula of evidence which shows that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for scaring us, as if we don't have enough scary evidence on this. And I hear actually Katya has a paper on how radio, the communication technology, helped Goebbels to bring Nazis to power and get more fascism spreading through Europe. And in that sense, indeed, the evidence is already scary. On which note, I would like to pass the microphone to Matt, who will talk about the scary consequences of social media on which we already have evidence. We mentioned that you may want to talk about your work on addiction and disinformation. And that's more social media than AI, but if you want to.
Great. Good, thanks. Yeah. That was great and really provocative. I think I'm a big fan of political experimentation and policy experimentation. I think living in the US, it's pretty clear the downsides of having a government that has a hard time doing that at all. And I think there's a lot to appreciate in that. I also think there is some value to evidence. So we'll try to fill in that side. I wanted to start, I guess, the talk I gave earlier was about this work we've been doing on addiction. And I wanted to start by saying, I think about all of the policy questions related to these new technologies, social media, and later, and also the social harms. I think in some ways, digital addiction is the one that I think maybe the least novel, and also maybe the one that, although I think it's very important, it ranks relatively lower in terms of like big tail risks to be worried about. I think if we had the ability to do the study that we did for social media with television in 1980, we very likely would have found qualitatively similar things, that people watch television, the 4.5, 5, 6 hours a day that people in the United States were watching television in those years, that people are watching more than they would like, that there is some habit forming evidence element, and that there's also definitely temptation at work. Now, there are reasons to think that those addictive forces may be greater in the context of social media. Certainly the quality of the tools available to figure out what engages people's attention are better, but huge resources have been devoted for a very long time toward doing that. And I think it's possible that, if anything, the role of algorithms and psychological profiling and so on in facilitating this kind of overconsumption may be exaggerated. Those things for sure play a role. I think it may be bigger, but it's not wildly bigger. So that's a comment on the addiction part. I don't think in absolute terms it's a small issue, but I think in relative terms there are things that I think are even more novel and in some ways of even greater concern. So just to summarize, just to say a few things that I see as even more new in social media. And some of these things have the potential to be increased by AI too. So first, just most obviously, in terms of content, social media has no gatekeepers for the most part, or has very limited gatekeepers in a way that a lot of previous technologies did not. And that just means that the extremity, the diversity, the variety of content, the tails of content that are out there are much, much greater. And the tails of content that people are exposed to without going and looking for it actively are much greater. So I think even on the sort of pre-social media internet, if you look at the data, there was all kinds of very extreme content available on the internet, but people's exposure to it was much lower. Now, I have a 13-year-old, and just looking at what he sees on TikTok, having downloaded the app and using it for a week, it's quite extreme. So that obviously is different, and I think creates a different scope for policy and regulation. I also think then the corollary of that is something that Nate mentioned, which is we may worry about the averages and sort of the impact of these technologies on average people, but I think maybe much more than some previous technologies, the most important issues are in the tails, the ways that it may be that the effects on the average person are fairly small. It may be that the effects on election outcomes, say, did Facebook swing a presidential election in the US? Those kinds of questions, those effects, what is the average effect of using Facebook on well-being? We have a lot of evidence on many of these questions. Those effects are real, but they're also, you know, not that big. Whereas issues like, you know, what is the impact on teenagers who are at risk of suicide? What is the risk of teenagers who are at risk of anorexia? What is the risk in creating things like ethnic violence in various parts of the world? We have lots of places where we can have huge social harms associated with content that is seen by a very relatively small minority of people. And I think that is fundamental. It makes it really hard to study empirically. I mean, this really is, you say, well, what is the evidence that Facebook facilitates anorexia? And I say, we don't have good like RCT, randomized control evidence for that, because in order to do a study that has enough power to identify impacts on those very small groups is incredibly difficult. So I think that's huge. And then the third thing I would say is there's a kind of a real distinct economic argument for regulation, and the fact that some, though not all of the issues, are really about coordination problems. So we talked in my presentation about the fact that what we can measure in these experiments are sort of partial equilibrium effects, where you change one person's behavior, keeping constant what everybody else is doing. As a parent, you know, if you have kids at all in this age range, that the ability unilaterally to change things when all of the other kids in the world and all of their parents are doing things differently is very, very limited. You can't, it's like, you can make things worse for kids by cutting them off from contact, from the ways that their peers interacting. And that just means whenever in economics you have something where you're in an equilibrium where nobody individually can change something, but where collectively we could change something to make it a lot better, that's a kind of fundamental core economic rationale for policy and for coordinated action of various kinds. Could be from the platforms, could be from policymakers, but I think that's important. So just to say really quickly, what does that imply about places where there is, from my perspective, the strongest case for policy to really play a role? I think I really put what's going on with kids and adolescents at the top of the list. I think there is just a huge amount that can be done there to basically to make it possible for parents who want to choose a default of having an experience for their kids, which they know is going to be certified to be safe in some basic way. Age verification, I think the case for age limits is strong. Basically, I'm not very worried about the risks of 12-year-olds not being on social media. The downsides of that do not seem, maybe there are some, maybe they're moderate. I'm really worried about it if all their friends are, but the dangers of no 12-year-olds being on social media do not seem enormous to me. So I think kids. Second, there's just a bunch of things that look like consumer protection here. Privacy, data protection fall squarely into that bucket. I'm not a big fan of things that are about disclosure and consent, particularly, so much as what are things that create defaults that are safe for consumers that require minimal or limited knowledge or intervention. We get a lot out of being able to go take an airplane and just kind of trust that somebody's keeping track of making sure that the airplane is safe. And I think things that can follow that template are powerful. And then the last thing I'd say on information and content, I think that how AI is going to impact this is really interesting. We've talked a lot about it. The one little bit I would throw in is I think one interesting impact of a world where that cost of producing misinformation and deepfakes and all this stuff just goes lower and lower and lower is that the value and the returns to being trusted sources go way up. And that's not a panacea. There will be lots of people who aren't interested in that, but I think we're going to continue to see that the economic returns to creating real trust go up as a result. And I think that's going to be some kind of counterweight.
Thank you, Matt. That takes us to even a more pessimistic view where we cannot trust any information because any information can come from somebody who is a deep fake and not a person. So we will only be able to communicate person to person. And so we go back to the Stone Age without communication devices. So Beatrice has recently co-authored a report for European Parliament on social media platforms and threats to democracy and challenges to democracy. Any optimistic ideas coming up from this report, or we are going down to this rabbit hole of scary things?
Does it work?
No. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I hope some optimism. Thank you. It's been really interesting to hear from all of you today. And I guess, yeah, I'll try to bring some optimism. It's also a little bit less ambitious than what we've heard before. But so yes, we were tasked at the law school to write a report on social media platforms and challenges for democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights. And that was perhaps the largest research question ever I faced. And so we actually focused on the challenges that content moderation, so only the upper layer of platforms, no data, no business models were posing. And we focused on the DSA, what we think could happen in the future, and maybe some room for improvement. One of the interesting things about writing this report is that we got the task exactly as ChatGPT was coming out. And we decided, I think there might be like a box somewhere, like a grade one on ChatGPT on the report. We decided not to introduce it there because it was already too much. But we did start by asking ChatGPT what it thought about it. And the report actually focuses on hate speech, disinformation, broadly speaking, and media pluralism. And I'm going to focus only a little bit on the European maybe conception of freedom, of having a rich and engaging information environment for democracy here. So one of the first things maybe that we learned while writing this report is that, as actually Matt was saying, information technologies disrupt democracy or whatever the governance system every time they show up. So there is anecdotal evidence and research about how radio was supposed to be the end of the world because now everyone with an antenna was being able to spread messages. There's very similar narratives about how pamphlets in the 19th century were also terrible. Like the printing press had become cheap enough for anyone to produce propaganda of different sorts, and you could in this primary sources you can really replace whatever the technology involved is with social media, and it sounds very much the same. My favorite example is actually from the printing press in the 1600s, where they're talking about misinformation, and they're talking about so that wasn't democracy. Democracy evolved out of that. But the printing press really helped disrupt power and how you transmit knowledge and trustworthy information. At the time, trustworthy information in the Middle Ages was transmitted through legacies. So you belong to an institution, for example, you belong to church, or you had been trained by this doctor, or you had been trained by this other, whatever, famous person. And that was how you showed up your legitimacy as an expert, as a professional. And so the printing press disrupted this because now you could write knowledge and spread it around, and there were very little ways to authenticate it. And so there was a big problem of misinformation. My favorite example is the philosopher Stone. So Nicolas Flamel, who even we know today was a very famous disinformant, let's call him. And he lived here in Paris. You can go to his house in Le Marais. Yeah. And that was like a very famous misinformation thing at the time that really challenged medicine, challenged a lot of things. So I really share and appreciated Paul's original insights that there's a lot of politics and institution making when this type of things come, but also that the result of technology isn't really predetermined. Societies sort of address these challenges with more success than others. And one of the things that led that these technologies disruptions led to was, for example, to an acknowledged and certified press for whatever the 10, 15 years maybe that they had of shining or so on. But that's the type of thing maybe that we're looking for. And in that sense, I really think, Matt, your comments earlier on how are we going to start to authenticate content given even ChatGPT is very important. And some comments, maybe more on the actual challenges when we're regulating this, is that it was very interesting for me to hear this morning about fake news or well, fake content, because that is really not a legal category. So fake news is in law, you have freedom of speech, for example, in the US, freedom of expression of information in the European Union, and freedom of expression and information in the European Union also implies a possible duty on the side of the state of government to create a healthy environment. That's very different from in the US, where the idea is to let everyone speak, more or less. But here it actually implies that if there is a threat to that information environment, if there's a threat for journalists, for minorities to speak up, to have their voice heard, the government needs to intervene. That's a lot of the logic in the DSA, for example, by trying to introduce some safeguards and risk mitigation where companies need to take these things into account. That creates several challenges at the content moderation layer, because content moderation is unfortunately very unreliable. It's very unreliable for different reasons. In the attempts to regulate content in a way that is, let's say, trustworthy and let's assume good faith, and it's very common that minorities get hurt. So a very classical example, and this happens both because the algorithms don't work very well or because they're trained by people who might be biased themselves, but also because content moderators are very badly paid. So it's also very easy for them to just mislabel things. So it's very common that something like a gay wedding gets labeled as toxic. So we are very careful in the report to not really recommend for stronger content moderation in a way that is either this is good content or that is bad content. Also because actually lying isn't illegal. So there is nothing wrong I don't think there's nothing wrong with saying that from tweeting that the sky is green today. It would be sort of unreasonable if we were to strike that down. So in the report, and following a bunch of the empirical research that a bunch of people here maybe do, we advocate more for content moderation measures in partnership with the platforms. The ESA introduces a bunch of things that are not only their own content moderation policies, but codes of regulation, codes of content moderation that they produce together, self-regulation, and so on, that focuses more on the type of content that is amplified and the type of friction that they introduce. So this is sort of not only content as what is published and isn't, which is, if you think about it, kind of an analog way of thinking about it, but the internet and digital interfaces of all sorts have a bunch of possibilities in design for amplifying and creating friction. You could decide not to strike down the content of a politician in Florida, for example, but you could amplify it less. And I don't know what that would happen in that law. But there's the type of thing where we see a lot of potential. It is really unfortunate, as Nate said earlier, that trust and safety teams are being cut down, because this type of insight really comes from a lot of the work of these folks or the Integrity Institute of things like that. And then the last thing that I would say is that maybe something that Europeans should also consider is being a little bit more creative and daring with the law and extending a lot of this to platforms like ChatGPT when it sort of allows to it. So this is a paper that I have forthcoming. And so very quickly told, in the US, at least, you could potentially argue that ChatGPT falls under Section 230. That's not necessarily the prevailing interpretation in Europe of the DSA, because the DSA says platforms that host user-generated content, ChatGPT is not user-generated content, it's AI-generated content, which leaves us, we think, in a legal vacuum. Why do I want to apply the DSA to ChatGPT? It might be true that the challenges are very different, but there's a bunch that are sort of similar. You have content moderators, and then you could, I don't know, pay them better so they can do a better job. ChatGPT is being sort of transparent. OpenAI, their technical reports are very interesting, but who knows if the other many providers that are out there are going to be as transparent. So you could actually oblige them to publish these things online. You could have takedown mechanisms that are mandatory, and so on. And the way I propose we do this is treating them as search engines. And then, of course, OpenAI says everywhere that ChatGPT isn't a search engine, but we're all using it as a search engine. So here, I think a more creative use of the law, a functional interpretation of the law could lead, because the DSA, for those who aren't lawyers, applies to search engines, even though random fact, search engines also don't host user-generated content. It's a information retrieved from a prompt, but based on it, it just throws you links. It doesn't throw you text. And that's maybe the type of thing that we might also need because we can't wait for the 3-4 years it'll take for the AI Act to be out. And those were my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. This is more optimistic than we could have hoped for. I promise not to talk, but let me react because there is the things I do work on. So you mentioned how new communication technologies are used. This is actually true. And there is a book by Martin Guri, who's called it Revolt of the Public. It's not well-read book, but the first edition came out in 2014. It was highly prophetic about 2016, where he was talking how new communication technology indeed empowers challengers to the system. And he was talking about printing press, the examples you've given. On radio, this is not just anecdotal. I mentioned Katya and co-author's paper on radio used by Nazis. There is also another recent paper on radio used by Father Cochran in the US, an extreme right, some people would even say fascist radio host. Let's put it this way in the US. US has not become a fascist country in the 1930s, luckily. The other challenger to the system was actually William Jennings Bryan, the first populist politician in the history of humanity, who was a presidential candidate in 1896, who used telegraph and railroads as a new telecommunication technology. You probably know him as a cowardly lion from The Wizard of Oz, because Wizard of Oz is actually a tale which describes the populist challenge to the system. But in real life, this politician has done an amazing job. And of course, there is also a paper, a classical paper on cable news in the US, which reinforced the right-wing politicians in the US when it was introduced. So, and this is not a coincidence, because if you're a challenger to the system, the mainstream media are controlled by the system. So you need to go around. What scares us with AI and with social media is that these particular communication technologies may be especially conducive, because of the issues we've discussed today, for disseminating messages that may result in January 6th storming of the Capitol and other challenges. On that, I would like to turn the floor to Constance, who is running McCourt Institute, or Project Liberty Institute, which is created to actually improve internet, so we don't have another January 6th. And the good thing about McCourt Institute is McCourt Institute wants to do things, not just talk about things. So we are going to hear something very specific and problem-solving approach rather than pessimistic statement.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate. And yes, I'm at the end of the table on the far left, but usually I say
That's
that
where you look from.
Of course. But in any case, in general, we like to position and present the Institute as being between researchers and policymakers. I come from the policy and NGO advocacy environment myself, not a researcher like our distinguished co-panelist. But it gives you a bit of an idea of how we try to work at the Project Liberty's McCourt Institute. We were founded a year and a half ago, as Sergei mentioned, in partnership with Sciences Po, but also in partnership with Georgetown University. And we're happy to have now a third institutional academic partner, which is Stanford University. We are there to accelerate, to support, to fund research through these three universities, but also to help them translate it into impact. We're interested in action-oriented research, notably in the field of social media, notably in the field of artificial intelligence. I would say in the field of emerging tech, digital tech in general. I will not use necessarily the term Web3, which can be debated and defined by eminent academics in different ways. So I don't want to make any mistakes there. I think the conversation until now showed that whether it's AI or social media, these technical trends are accelerating the complex ethical issues, maybe also legal issues we have around digital technologies. Artificial intelligence being one, obviously. We've talked about some of the challenges for democracy. We shouldn't underestimate the economic challenges when we think about jobless displacements. I think Nate alluded to it on the previous panel. An organization like the OECD estimates that 9% of the jobs will be impacted, but Oxford says it's 40%. They're all very intelligent. Who's right? I don't know, but certainly somewhere in between there will also be some economic challenges in addition to democratic challenges. Reacting perhaps to my colleague Paul Nemitz on the panel, who has insisted on the value and the importance of regulation, which certainly has some positive and necessary aspects. The approach we also try to emphasize, which is certainly complementary to the pure regulatory approach, is the fact that we believe that technology to start with should be designed in an ethical fashion. And yes, the EU we are all acknowledging a form of what you call regulatory renaissance. Would everybody say that it is totally positive, this regulatory leadership that the EU is asserting? I don't know. I would love to see as much technology innovation leadership in EU as innovative, I would say, as regulatory innovation power, being a European and a French citizen myself. Coming back to this notion of perhaps ethics by design, which certainly is not opposite, but perhaps complementary to regulation, EU or other types of regulation from other parts of the world. It was interesting to see that the AI Act that was released just very recently, again, is very interesting, but it looks at the issues in reaction to the issues. It's not what we would call ex ante regulation. And if I remember correctly, in 21, the European Commission issued a paper around ethics by design by artificial intelligence, which from my perspective, issues some recommendations and some ideas which should be as important as the ones that are contained in the AI Act. So perhaps this invitation to think about regulation in a more holistic way, ex post plus ex ante approach, which also implies thinking in a more granular way about what ethics by design means. I'm convinced, and this is something we're inclined to fund at the Institute, more ideas in this specific field about accelerating technologies that are going to hit the market while they will contain in an embedded fashion ethical principles. So you talked about the fuzziness of ethics. I would perhaps push back slightly on the fact that ethics by design are fuzzy. I actually think they can be quite crisp and actually extremely tangible, because if well designed, then they become technical features in the technology itself. So that's perhaps a point to complement. And then finally, coming back also to the way we intend to work at the Institute, we are very attached to the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach to policy regulation, tech regulation, also design in general. In this sense, this is why it's very important for us to be acting in a way to valorize the research so that policymakers can fully acknowledge that there's expertise out there, and perhaps include those academics at the table so that they can voice their concerns, their ideas, but also provide input into those conversations. Jacinda Ardern just last week issued in the Wall Street Journal a really interesting piece talking about how we could win these challenges, overcome the challenges specifically with regards to artificial intelligence, and insisted on the fact that it would be only solely through a fully multi-stakeholder approach, including ethics by design, that we could hope to be effective in this field. And just to conclude, this is a constant approach we have in all the working groups that we set up, whether it's on governance of blockchain, governance of digital identity, whether it's on ethical principles for responsible tech. That is an important work we're conducting with the Aspen Institute. We'll be holding, Sergey, with your authorization, an event actually in September around this topic at Sciences Po. We are very aware and very attached to the necessity of broadening the circle and making sure that we have also academics part of these conversations with policymakers.
Thank you very much, Constance. We will still have time, about 20 minutes for questions. Nate, please go ahead.
Thanks. This is for Paul, and it's in some ways I want to be a bigger advocate for Europe even than you are in this, which is so when the platforms tell you where is the evidence, I think in some ways the response is you have it, give it to us, right? And so one of the and this is sort of a two-pronged comment in saying that the in some ways the most effective part of the DSA may be Article 40, because it's going to force the platforms to open up their data to outside research. And I worry that that is going to be perceived in Europe and elsewhere as a kind of special advantage for people like me, you know, but Europe, let alone any country, doesn't have the capacity right now to enforce anything on the scale of DSA or the AI Act, just that there's just not enough people, right, who have the relevant expertise in government. However, the beauty of the DSA is that you are, in a sense, getting a lot of free labor of people who really want to be involved in this process, to assess systemic risks, to look at what mitigation strategies might work. And so that once the troves of data are made available next, whatever it is, February, this is a kind of new regulatory environment that you are enabling, which will allow outsiders to support the government officials who are going to be in charge of intervening here in a way that we really haven't seen. And so so they're not going to be able to, you're going to be prepared to answer those when they say, well, where's the evidence? We will have the evidence in ways that we never have before. And I think it'll be, you know, it's really critical that we get that part of the DSA right, that there not be a lot of bickering. Particularly, I worry a little bit about how the academics are going to behave, frankly, in this, but that I mean, and I've said this in comments with respect to the DSA, forcing them to admit to what data sets they have ready already, that we can then have access to start work immediately once this is available. Because you know, the strange thing about Facebook, because of all these technological changes I was talking about before, we got to study these platforms before they're completely transformed, right? We need to understand what's actually been happening on them over the last few years in order to then assess these systemic risks and what the mitigation strategies would be.
Thank you for this enthusiasm, Maya. Some people would say that the US is a technological superpower, while the EU is a regulatory superpower. Want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just say, I think, you know, you'd only get ethics by design if the law says it. And GDPR says it actually. It says, you know, privacy by default and by design. So, you know, if you want to have ethics by design, well, make it a legal obligation. But then the question is still, what ethics and who makes those choices? And sorry, you know, I mean, we have a value system in our constitutions and we don't need a different one. So I would say the values which are put into the technology, they should be decided in a democratic process and should not be the individualistic choice of, you know, this or that company, which, you know, can do ethics or not as they like. On the point of the DSA, yes, I think you are right. Let's see how this is going to work. You know, we have an election in Europe before us. We will have a new commission, which will be politically composed. And then much of the enforcement will depend on, you know, the political will of the commission. It is very different in data protection. the power of the data protection authorities, it goes much further. They can see everything if they want. And my ambition would be rather, in addition or in parallel, to increase the pressure on the data protection authorities. We have to call them to account, and we need new strategic litigation which forces the data protection authorities to do exactly what you are asking for, namely look deep, not only into the treasure trove of personal data, but also into the algorithms, into all these systems. And, so the good news there is that in GDPR, we have all those mechanisms in place. I mean, Max Schrems, he can bring his cases from Vienna, none of your business. I was a co-founder of his NGO. And this is, I think, for the time being, I would say, it's more likely that we get there through the instruments of the data protection authorities, which are, tried and trained, and we have, they are fragmented, but, the CNIL and the Germans and the Spanish and the Italians, they are good and they have qualified staff. Let me say a last word about the platitude of Europe being the regulator of the world and the others to invent the technology. It is really boring. Because I have to say this often, it is a very, I mean, what is this about? Don't we have to be proud about the fact that democracy still works in Europe? I mean, I had a discussion with Lawrence Lessig in the American Academy of Science in Boston, and he said, Paul, you can still call for laws, but in America, it's hopeless. Yeah. So, why are we talking down democracy? Why are we talking down the most noble act of speaking of democracy, which is a law, which America is not delivering anymore? We should be proud about the fact that our democracy works. And if we mean it with a crisis of democracy and we want to do something against it, we cannot at the same time make all these platitude jokes about democracy and delegitimize the law, by insinuating that maybe technological solutions would be better. And by the way, the vaccines, for example, for COVID and so on, they came from Europe, and many other good things come from Europe. And so there is absolutely no issue that we are a very innovative country in technology, and we are a very innovative continent in technology, in business, and also in democracy. And I think we want to have all three of them. And, and those people who say, oh, in China, every airport is built faster than in Europe, and, therefore Europe is no good. I say, goodbye, go to China and enjoy the communist dictatorship. And I am tending to think, for those people who think that they live better in America without legislation and, in the polarized society, which comes in part from a lack of democratic ability. And we will see it in the next elections, what the result is. I would say, have a good day. We are a free continent. Go. I am proud of the fact that in Europe, we have great innovations, and the vaccines is just my platitude, boring counterexample against those who say, oh my God, are we not innovative? But we also still have a functioning democracy. And I would say rather, let's fight for it and not against it.
Thank you, Paul. We are all in favor of rule of law and democracy, that's for sure. Questions? Other questions? Or yeah. Thanks. Go.
All right. Well, I have a couple of comments and one questions, but I see the time, so I'm probably going to just stick to the question, right? Perhaps one comment first, though. You talked about airplanes, and I think it's a great example. So I'm a teacher here at Sciences Po. I teach about blockchain technologies, and I speak at various conferences about blockchain technologies and how can we use them for public good. And I often hear people telling me, oh, well, people should not have to understand blockchain technologies in order to use it, right? When I drive my car, I do not understand how it works. And you said, how good would it be to have digital services that we can trust as we trust airplanes when we get when we get in them, right? And I think that's a wonderful example that people use against its actual meaning. When you get into an airplane, you entrust your life to a piece of technology that is the legacy of hundreds of years of engineering and decades of regulation that has been tested over and over and over again. And to people who are legally responsible for your life and who have been trained extensively for years. Same thing for a car. in order to drive your own car, you first need to go through a training, theoretical and practical, for several years before having the right to drive it in order to not be a danger for yourself and for society in general. And same thing, the car itself is an object that is very heavily regulated. So it's become one of those arch example of people defending tech exceptionalism of I do not need to understand tech in order to be able to use it properly. And actually it's a big, like the car or plane example proves exactly the opposite, is that we need a lot of regulation in order to trust those technical objects that are not neutral, that are not to be trusted with so easily. And so going to my question, that was the comment, going to my question, tech that is ethical by design, I believe, is very much wishful thinking as much as we do not, as much as we conceive it as being enshrined in an economic context in which we need to, any company needs to maximize the profit, right? And we've seen it in Meta. Nate was mentioning how they had to get rid of their ethical staff. We've seen it in Microsoft, how the first thing they did once OpenAI boomed was to ditch their AI ethicist. So trusting that AI can be, or tech in general can be ethical by design in a fully ultra-liberal and capitalist setting without regulation to force companies to be ethical, I believe is very difficult. Unless, and that's where my question comes, unless you build tech with alternative models. And so how much do you, the four of you, perhaps that will be a quick roundtable question, believe in digital commons as an alternative model to build technology, to build tech that would have ethics baked in because it obeys different forms of governance and different goals for the tech itself?
Thank you. I think it's a question for Matt, but it's also a question for everybody.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure whether your comment was directed at what I said, but I think we're totally in agreement. I mean, my point about that is exactly that I think that provides scope for regulation. I think blockchain and cryptocurrencies and a lot of related products are a perfect example of how products and technologies premised on the ability of users to have a sophisticated understanding tend to go badly. I think that in many contexts, the private sector does have a role to play in solving those kinds of problems. And I think, some of why banks say work better than crypto exchanges in many respects relates to those banks' own reputational incentives. But I think there's definitely an important role for regulation there. And I think we're exactly aligned on that point. I'll leave others to speak to digital commons.
Yeah, I'll try to take that one a little bit. I've worked on digital commons and I love them. They don't scale very well. And so I think one of the things that we've sort of discussing here is the regulation of tech itself. But something that maybe that we've discussed less is that the interplay between tech and regulation is a little bit more complex. So you have direct regulation, but you also have technologies that evolve with law and law that evolves with regulation. If we go back to the printing press example, which is a very easy one, because I hope no one here is an expert on the printing press, it allowed the law to be written down. And that really changed how we think about democracy. Like the idea that law is written down and public is something that is only possible in a universe where you have a technology that makes that publicity possible. And so I think that interface is a little bit more complex and it changes a little bit what we mean by ethical tech. But it also, back to your question on digital commons, I believe more in varieties of capitalism. So I do think there are very interesting examples about social media that is owned by its members, but that doesn't grow very well. You have amazing, the big example, the jewel of the crown is FOSS and Wikipedia, but those are very specific examples, often underfed. But what you do see is that technology develops differently in different societal contexts because capitalism isn't a uniform thing. Like capitalism looks very, very different in France than it looks in the US, than it looks in Colombia, where I'm from, than it looks in China, that is actually also very capitalistic in many ways. And those developments, because the structure of incentives are very different, is important. And I think that's very much worth looking at, because I think something that's going to be interesting to look at is how does the impacts on work on generative AI are different in societies that have training, public training embedded into them. So maybe there's a universe in between in which European countries are going to be able to retrain people if they do it well in a way that's going to hit the market harder in other places. So data comments are good examples of things that should be done, can be done, should be supported. But I think regulating our societal structures, our economic structures as the underlying layer where tech is eventually put on is a thing that scales a little bit more.
Thanks. As we are moving from the right to the left, let me add a word as an economist. I've seen how varieties of capitalism actually change. On consumer protection, we've gone a long way. So I'll give you an example that people in developed countries don't fully understand. In developing countries 20 years ago, it was completely common to take a mortgage in a foreign currency. You take a mortgage in Swiss francs or euros in Eastern Europe or Asia, because these are the currencies where it's very stable, so interest rates are low. Except when you have a crisis, suddenly your country devalues and you discover that your mortgage is much more expensive. And that really hit many countries. And by now, consumer protection consensus is we don't believe that retail borrowers can understand those risks. So in most of these countries, such loans are now banned. So it's as a matter of consumer protection. We say you don't fly this particular airplane because you don't understand currency risks, and that is completely against the variety of capitalism we were just 20 years ago. And this is something that we see happening in real times. How we introduce more and more regulation to protect people who don't understand what's going on. But your question is also leading us to something that we just discussed. Does that mean that in order to vote, you should take a Sciences Po 5-year training, right? And social science, because without that, you don't understand how important law is to democracy, how to handle digital information and misinformation, how to understand the interaction between political science and legal studies. To what extent we think that people who cannot read and write should be able to vote, to what extent we allow people to vote, people who've not even read the program, don't have the degree to read the program. I think this is a challenge to our understanding that should allow everybody to be a citizen. This is a question of one person, one vote may take us too long. One thing is to ban you from buying Bitcoin. The other one is, and I should tell you, Matt is probably on the same page. Economists were shocked to see that people live in Bitcoin, live in stable coin, which is unregulated bank, subject to bank run from day one. And so we didn't think that that may actually go as big as it was. But voting, to what extent we should impose a driver's permit test for every citizen. So in order to vote, you need to take your class or your.
Absolutely. Yeah. The point on regulation was really to say voting is inclusive and those tech can be inclusive as far as you have regulation and provision of public services such as free education in order to get people to the level of exercising those rights.
Yeah. So secondary education for everybody, social science curriculum for everybody. If you don't get an A, sorry. Paul? Yeah.
I'm in favor of a pluralistic approach. So, I like this idea. We have to have different forms of counterpower, but, I wrote my book not about the nice democracy and rule of law in artificial intelligence age, but power at democracy and rule of law. Why? Because let's not kid ourselves. We are dealing with the greatest power concentration Earth has seen in these tech companies. And, I have my 8 points on power concentration, which I could give you now, and it doesn't end with and start with, they are always top at 10 of the US stock exchange. So if it's about power, we have to, not be naive. And to think that we, tomorrow we start this movement and this movement and this movement. Well, I'm in favor of pluralistic approach. Let that be done. And let's put some public money into it. But the best chance, I would say, is hard law. These companies need a hard hand, otherwise forget it. And so that's why, if you ask me where I would put my most money, let's make hard laws and frame by obligatory laws which can be enforced with the power of government and the state this technological world. The other things are nice to have, but some of them also have been created with a lot of money from big tech. For example, the multi-stakeholder approach, Internet Governance Forum and so on. They love it. It's a talking shop, has never led to anything. Oh yeah, let's have a debate. Yeah, but it leads to nothing. So, if our focus is we want to see change, we have to think the process to the end. And Google and Facebook, they are great in financing processes which lead to an eternal debate, but never anything happens. That's the battle cry of the lobbyist in Brussels. Let's have a debate. Sure, multi-governance debate, multi-stakeholder debate, sure, as if parliaments and governments don't listen to everyone. It's already an element of talking down democracy. What's happening in the European Parliament? What's happening in the national parliament? It's a total multi-stakeholder debate. Much better than the IGF, because in the end, it leads to something. And you can even hold people accountable for if it not leads to something.
Thank you. We unfortunately have to finish, so I'm giving the floor to Constance. We have 2 questions online. We'll send them to the speakers afterwards, but these are the questions from John Ross and from Thomas B, which are excellent questions, but you will enjoy getting them by email. And I believe that you have actually answered those questions, unfortunately.
And I promise to be succinct, and I'm actually not sure there's a clear disagreement. I think, of course, if the norm is important as a precondition to democracy, of course, law, but why not, in addition, some ethics by design? I think it's just a question of mix and balance.
On this optimistic note, we finish this roundtable, which is the closing event of this half a day. And I would like to thank everybody, specifically Frank, who has come up with this idea, Inga, who's organized everything, who's a liaison officer for McCourt Institute at Sciences Po, McCourt Institute, which is Project Liberty Institute, for supporting this event, Center for Economic Policy Research, and my colleagues at Sciences Po have helped to organize it. And first and foremost, the speakers who spoke earlier today, and speakers on the panel especially came from afar, even though coming to Paris is always a pleasure. Thank you very much. And there is a cocktail waiting outside when you close.